morning. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name is Patricia and I'm a bookseller here at Malaprops. It's a pleasure to be here with Steacy. And this evening, we'll talk about Steacy's book and also some of the ways that Steacy did the research for it and just that whole backstory of Tammy Wynette and their exploration of country music and the context with which we could use to understand Tammy Wynette's legacy. But before we get started, I want to, of course, thank my colleagues, the Director of Author Events, Stephanie Jones-Byrne, who is behind the scenes working the YouTube chat. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And I'd also like to thank James Harrod, who is here with us, helping us with author events and selling books this evening. So thank you all so much for being that great team. Let me tell you a little bit about how you can pose questions this evening for Steacy. And of course, we'll get to as many as we can. You have two options. The first option is you can log into the YouTube chat and post your question directly into the YouTube chat.
I'm sorry.
Hi, this is what we're doing. Yay. And so you can log into YouTube, post your question in the YouTube chat. We would appreciate it, please, if you would start your question with a Q. The second way that you can pose a question to Steacy is by sending us an email. We have a dedicated email address, and you'll see this in all this information in the chat. Stephanie is placing it there. The email address is virtualqa@malaprops.com, virtualqa@malaprops.com. And again, we'll get to as many questions as we can. And I have some questions for Steacy too, because I was raised on Tammy Wynette. So I'm really looking forward to talking about this book, Why Tammy Wynette Matters, with Steacy Easton. Let me tell you a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about Steacy. Steacy's written about country music for 15 years and has written for NPR, Slate, and The Atlantic. They are a PhD student in critical disability studies at York University, and Steacy hails from Hamilton, Ontario. And we're delighted that Steacy is in the store this evening to talk about why Tammy Wynette matters. Steacy, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's dive right in, shall we?
We shall.
All right. So as we were talking about before, you knew a little bit about the series. You have friends who've written for the series.
Well, colleagues, yeah, for sure.
Friends and colleagues who've written for the series. So you're in great company. And let's get started. What about Tammy Wynette drew you to this topic? What did you think initially when you got this assignment?
Yeah, well, I pitched the assignment, so
okay.
But I asked to do it, and I've been working on this sort of idea of Tammy for a long time. I've been since I was 12. In 12th grade, I had an assignment from an English teacher named Deborah Kelly, and she did at the end of the year. She did country assignments for everybody. And she gave us a song and we had to talk about it in sort of like poetry. And one of the questions I had pretty consistently was, this is around the Hillary Clinton kerfuffle and all of that. It kind of felt like she was hard done by, and there was also, she was incredibly difficult. And I think it was one of those times in my life where an ambiguous narrator occurred, or one of the first times in my life that I felt a profound ambivalence about somebody, and that I could be something aside from a fan or a detractor. And that was kind of broke me in some ways. Oh. And I didn't go back. I didn't listen to a lot of country after that for a long time. And then I moved to Toronto in my 20s. I grew up just outside of Edmonton in Alberta. And I was I guess a little homesick. And then I started sort of taking country fairly seriously as a critic. And I always sort of returned back to Wynette. Um, I found that she was a complex figure. A lot of things I'm interested in about how capital works, about how gender is performed, about domesticity. She's a ready example. And I really loved her music. I just adored what she sang.
Well, let me ask you about that idea of ambivalence, because certainly you get into the politics.
Yeah.
Really the politics of Tammy Wynette,
Yeah.
right? Because she was part of the McGovern, the George Wallace. She was a part of, not McGovern.
Wrong George.
Wrong George, wrong party. She was a part of the George Wallace campaigns, right?
Yeah.
Ardent segregationist, arch conservative. How did you, as you were delving into her story and her connection to George Wallace, what did you think? And how did you, what were your sources for looking at that?
That's the actually really interesting thing. There's Wynette's daughters both wrote a biography, and well, her daughter George Jones wrote a biography about Jones that includes Wynette. And there's a book by McDonough called Tragic Country Queen that has some of that about it. And she wrote an autobiography with Joan Dew. So that was some of the sources, but it was also a lot. I always felt that she was underwritten about or underconsidered in some capacity, that she was always written in relationship to other people and often relationships to the men in her life. And so even with the autobiography, and so it was a lot of primary research. It was a lot of looking at newspaper archives online and old clips and trying to work out. I've not forgotten the author, but there's a beautiful book. I'll put it in the chat later. About the politics country called about red states and blue states, that had a chapter on this giant event that she had for Wallace as a significant turn between. I can't believe I forgot the title. It's been a long day.
Okay.
And that was big for me too.
Right.
To recognize that sort of her work with Wallace as a symbolic act was key in that moment.
Do you think it's challenging as an author and as a critic to address that kind of ambivalence? How do you communicate ambivalence in your book? Can you think of an example?
Yeah. A couple of things. I think that's actually really significant right now. There's a tendency to want to think of criticism as just positive agreements with something and not be in dialogue with something. And I think one of the reasons why I'm a critic of this history of criticism for me is this context of social spaces and dialogue and conversation. And so, but that said, it was really difficult in some ways. And I think difficult in a couple ways. I think difficult in the most obvious way, where I didn't know how somebody who I am functions in relationship. I don't have a wife. I don't have a partner. I don't have children. I don't have a house. I don't know of any of those things in my future. And so Wynette is so central to this domestic life. And so the isolation for partly is trying for me to understand how the domestic functions. And recognize that there's not often work written about that in relationship to critical discourses, that I think there's great art who is capable to be made of the domestic. And I don't think we pay attention to that. So that's the first bit. That was the isolation that I think is less explicit. And the other part is that Wynette's politics are very much not my politics. And how Wynette handles class, not how I handle class, and how Wynette handles sort of gender and sexuality is not how I, which relates to the first problem, and obviously the racial problem. I'm very white. So I try to talk about the racial stuff, recognizing from my position of power and privilege. But I was also, I think it's really important to recognize the skill set or the tools or even the gut feelings that we have about gender and sexuality can not only exist talking about ourselves. And I think that we have to consider how gender is performed or constructed or made real within that whole context. And so I have the set of training that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking if I'm considering how gender is performed, which is one thing I'm continually curious about, especially how gender is performed in relationship to class. That Tammy is an example of that as well. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's obviously distance, as obviously like we have to treat the whole person, not treat. Treat's the wrong word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, like address or kind of really
Consider.
Yeah, consider that.
Yeah.
There's a new book out that's gotten some publicity, and it's called Monsters: A Fan Guide.
Yeah.
Have you heard of this book?
I haven't read it.
Right, and that's okay, because I think your book fits very well into this larger debate about if you have an individual, an artist, who is you might see as ambivalent. You find out things about this artist. How do you consider, and can you continue to appreciate, engage, even dare I say enjoy their art, knowing what one would know about that person in their life?
And there's an amazing book by Charlie Fox. I'm not good with titles today.
That's okay.
That is similar to Monsters: A Guide. And I've been thinking about the Charlie Fox book. I'm thinking about the Charlie Fox book too. Like, glamour is seductive. It's originally thought to be seductive. It has this sort of explicitly mystical pull. And so I don't think you put something aside. I think that the role of somebody with as much charisma as Wynette is to seduce the stage, is to pull you in. And so part of that resistance of pulling in is to consider, as I said, her whole self. But if like you watch her on the, like, especially in like late 70s, full gowns, high heels, jewels, it is a sort of, and in the same sense that maybe in some ways the diva is a diva because she's monstrous. There's this like Medea, or there's like Maria Callas on the stage, or there's Elizabeth Taylor in her experimental 1960s phase.
Virginia Woolf. Who's afraid of Virginia Woolf, right?
Exactly. And so I think that's it. I think the Charlie Fox's book and the Monsters books he recommended that I haven't read it yet is very much about that. And recognizing that, and also not allowing that to be an excuse, because I can have that conversation and we can talk about that, but also recognize that we have to do a full accounting. And I think that we have a tendency also to do a fuller accounting with women than we do with men. It was that I think that we have a tendency to let men off their monstrosity more than we let women off their monstrosity. And it was also funny. I was talking to my friend Ben, who is one of the copy editors in this, who's a genius poet, and Ben Robinson, and he had this line. We were going back and forth about how difficult and terrible woman Wynette was, and he acknowledged that. And then he said, well, she's not Sylvia Plath. Like she's not Anne Sexton. So like there's a point there.
Right, I see that you're really engaging this subject and you're kind of bouncing it off of other people and
Yeah,
they're compelled by this story.
yeah,
And the times that we're in and
Yeah.
trying to discover how we engage someone about we feel very emotional.
yeah,
We feel emotionally, and some of us can see ourselves
yeah.
in some of those songs. Um, let's talk a little bit about how your book suggests that Tammy's story interacts with and departs from those of Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn. I mean, it's sort of like the trifecta of women in country music
Yeah.
at one point. And I
Absolutely.
remember these women, and of course, Dolly Parton's very important in this area, very influential. So what say ye about this subject?
It's fascinating. There's a couple of things about it I think are really important. I think that one of them could put a whole spectrum of like public engagement with them, right? Which I find really interesting. That Dolly is very much a public figure and she has this great line about selling in and not selling out, and is very much considered sort of the whole her public as wide of a circle as possible. And Loretta, I think, would be happy just singing for people in Kentucky. That she made masterpieces and it's just brilliant. But she had a very small moment in that space, which was important, I think. And then the other thing about that moment is Tammy was kind of in the middle in that space, right? Where she very much was a conduit between sort of various kinds of country music, but I think stayed within her genre. And I think so that's when the genre changed, she had a bit of isolation. And I think the exception for that is the KLF single, Just Friend and Ancient. But I also wonder if she died young, she died really young. And she didn't have that third career. And she died in a bit of a lull. Like she had a big space with with Just for a Nation single. And then she worked with Loretta and Dolly for the Honky Tonk Angels
Right.
Albums, which did relatively well. But I wonder if they were a little bit of a rescue project for Dolly. But thinking about Loretta's work with Jack White and Van Der Rose, and thinking about Dolly's Grass is Blue, which happened just after she, a few years after she passed. One of the fascinating things for me is the possibility that there's this counterfactual that can exist, right, between what happens after Wynette dies. Like, and I think, like any good drama queen, Wynette lives on a cliffhanger, right? Like her last, she was a little uptick, a little success. So I do wonder. And then I've been thinking a lot about this late 2001 Connie Smith album, which nobody listened to, but it's genius. And part of me wonders if I just want, we all have this one book or this one film or this one album that if the universe was kinder than it was, than it is, that we would be able to hear it. And I want the
say it here. You have the audience of the world.
I want the Tommy Smith, Connie Smith, in the multiverse where Tammy Wynette lasts another 40 years. I want the wise and sad Rick Rubin produced Connie Smith. Yeah, that's what I really want. That
makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, so what draws you as a trans and non-binary writer to Tammy's story? And to country music more generally?
Well, there's this song that didn't, this is my secret goal for the entire Books tour, is to make everybody listen to this Tammy Wynette song called Womanhood.
Okay.
Like I always make this joke that Dolly Parton made me trans. Like the first album I ever had was Bargain Store. And if anybody was performing gender, it was Dolly. But this Tammy Wynette album, there's a song on it, the title track. And it's normally about somebody, a kid losing, a girl losing her virginity. But it's not about that, because Tammy's singing it. Tammy's in her, I don't know, 40s at this point. And just giant brassy voice, and the production is thick, and it's all very 70s. And I don't know why she put it in the album. I don't know why.
Right.
I don't know why she gave us this gift. It's the cover of the album is actually the cover of the book. And but there's this great line in it about how she says, Lord, I am a Christian, but I'm a woman too.
Yes.
And then she has this line about stepping into her womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
And trans people and queer people and disabled people always read against the grain and read against, because there's not a familiarity there, right? We're always outside of the text, and we're always outside of the world, and especially working class queer folk. We're doubly outside the text. And so we need to find places where that fits. And so I love that idea of putting on your womanhood. Like it's like non-canonical, foundationally non-canonical, and foundationally where I'm at. that's why translating of Tammy Wynette is putting on that womanhood. And I mean that sort of half as a joke, but also that there's nobody who performs gender more than queer folk and drag and about drag, obviously, but also sort of just daily life. And I sort of make this joke about like Dolly performing womanhood, but the whole context of Tammy Wynette trying to figure out how to publicly be private, or publicly talk about the domestic, or publicly construct her gender in ways that are palatable to a commercial audience, very much as part of that conversation as well, at least for me.
Well, when we talk about that commercial side,
Yeah.
that you really are, and you've addressed this certainly with the idea of seducing an audience, and there's certainly this element of, don't you want me? Don't you want my song? Don't you want this life? Can't you relate to this? Don't you want to have these? I'm selling you these feelings. There's that element, the commercial element to it. What do you give Tammy Wynette a tremendous amount of credit for being savvy and sophisticated about the business, and that she's really been not only underappreciated, but not seen as a smart operative as a businesswoman. She's more that kind of package as a kind of a dumb blonde. So what kind of work did you have to do to recover and make that argument, recover that info, that knowledge, and prove it, and then make that argument in your book?
I think it's just, you don't sell out arenas and do package tours and not make money, right? Like you don't survive living with George Jones and be stupid. There's a bunch of problems with surviving George Jones, but and I think it's also just being generous to an artist. And I think that's also really one of the things I consider, is that sort of critics, especially as I said, white dudes, spend a lot of time narrowing authorship as much as humanly possible. And considering that gender and sexuality, sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Considering that writing a song is writing a song, and performing a song is performing a song, and that writing and performing a song are the absolute key to the whole process. And so any of the other ways you can be an author, any of the other collective ways of working a text together are not considered as legitimate. And I think that once that breaks down, once you realize all kinds of ways of working together, it leads you sort of to the traditional understanding of women's work, and leads you very much to an understanding that women's genres are often not considered, are considered minor things like romances, or women's work is considered about minor things. Quilting.
Like housework is not
Yeah.
really work because it's not paid. So it's
Exactly.
just off the books.
And so you can't make great art about housework. One of
Chantal Ackerman did, right? Is that what we can
no,
say?
like Tammy Wynette did.
Yeah.
Like, I was talking to my friend Josh about Annie Arnaud, and like Annie Arnaud describes like the concrete of French suburbs in ways that are just revelatory and which are never considered by anybody else because of how you look through them. Yeah, and but I was thinking about this, and this is the example I always use, that George Jones wrote Le Grand Tour, and it's considered the greatest country song of all time. And it's a good song. Like, I never want to overcorrect. Well, I do kind of, but
It's all right.
this time I'm going to allow myself. But it's a song about going out, about sadness that, or he stopped loving her today. It's an exterior song.
Yeah.
And there's not a song. And then if you look at Apartment Number 9, it's an or he stopped loving I Don't Want to Play House or Just Stay Home. They're very interior songs. And I find it really interesting when, even in terms of country music, when we're making canon, that the interiority of the domestic and how the interiority of the domestic corresponds to the interiority of a person's life is considered less artful than when the exteriority of the Ranger or the Rover or of that sort of thing.
Right. The highwaymen.
Exactly.
The men going out on the journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Versus the
Rovers.
staying at home.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about, for those of us who grew up on that kind of country radio, and I remember that in the 70s, my parents really, it was a deep immersion.
Yeah.
And of course, Stand By Your Man was, let's say it was on heavy rotation, right? But so was DIVORCE.
Yeah.
When you're looking at, how did you take a fresh look? What is it like for you to try to reconsider anew those songs, or songs that you made, or songs maybe not those that you loved or really embraced?
Yeah, Said by Your Man is one of my favorites, which made it easier. Like,
Okay.
like it's not. I think it's not even my top 10 of Tammy songs. But it becomes the thing that is larger than itself, and so the easy way to go by it is talk around it instead of through it, and it's easy to do that because it's such a political figure. It's such a monolithic text, and so you end up talking about the infamous Hillary Clinton episode, or you end up talking about sort of Lyle Lovett's cover, or Robbie Folke's cover, which I thought was sort of made fun of or was snarky. And then you go back and listen to it after you've done a kind of hedge clearing. And you always want to have more ambivalence than maybe there is in the text. But there's this great line by Dolly that she says that Tammy sang Stand By Your Man, but she never did.
Right.
And so they have that separation between persona and personhood. And then and then I take this sort of political commitment of taking this domestic stuff seriously.
Right.
And you recognize that domestic art is serious art and what that means. And then you recognize, for me personally, that perhaps it was aspirational, that perhaps it wasn't a sort of political moment, perhaps it was something she wanted. And people are allowed to want things. And then you also have to be really careful not, if she's smart, she knows the political power of her text, and she'll say repeatedly that it wasn't, she didn't intend it to be that political, but then she rewrites it for the segregationist. And so you're in this moment, like, you know exactly what power that has. Hey, Tammy knows exactly what amount of power that has. And so, and then I find it also really fascinating. David Cantwell, who's an absolute genius, wrote a revised running guide in his book on Merle Haggard this year, which is one of the 3 or 4 best books in country, written, recorded, and had a really good year in country books. But one of the things he talks about is Okie from Muskogee, and that this Okie from Muskogee had this incredibly long history as being used as sort of this reactionary propaganda. And Haggard's politics were more unruly than Tammy's, but he had to spend a lifetime, working this text that wasn't necessarily his. And I feel that way about Wynette too, is that she becomes trapped by this, I've gotten probably the timeline wrong, but she says, I wrote it in an hour and I spent my entire life working, and that's also fascinating. So just, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I find that, just as a listener, very moving to think about someone being trapped by a song, and really that making me see her and with fresh eyes. And I really appreciate your book, Why Tammy Wynette Matters, for bringing that to the table, to the living room, to the kitchen table. Let's put it in the domestic setting. I want to just see if we have any questions from the audience. Audience, please feel free to post in the chat if you have any. Otherwise, I certainly do have some more questions for Steacy. So,
are there any questions?
No, she gave me the we're still bringing them in. Now, you talk about Tammy Wynette's vocal performance, and we live in a time, and I'm certain, and it was probably true then, where you and Alec Baldwin even talked about this, how there's a way to make a poor voice, and he was talking about his own, sound great. That was probably for that film Rock of Ages, where he was singing and falling in love with Russell Brand, right? What did you learn about Tammy Wynette's vocal ability that we may have underappreciated or missed?
I think it's always phrasing. And she was a belter, and watching her, I had friends of mine at the Hamilton Lounge, my hometown, perform a couple of 3 songs before the opening, and it was great. And when I was in this rehearsal studio for an hour or 2, listening to them play, and they played versions of Womanhood back to back, and there was a live version, and then there was a studio version, and the live version was really fast. And then there was, and it reminded me of, there's this live bootleg of her doing something in the Burt Reynolds Dinner Theater in 89. And it was, she had 9 songs in 12 minutes, 13 minutes, just this medley, just like a train. And then I think about her best songs, Stand By Your Man, or I Don't Want to Play House, or DIVORC, and they're all there's never anything longer than 4 minutes. So the fact that she can just completely wrench your heart out in 4 minutes is just, it's just incredible. She's a honky tonk singer. She's a serious singer, and sometimes that sort of self-seriousness you had to be careful of not being camp, but also there was very camp performances. As much as I love Apartment Number 9, as much as I think it's just profoundly sad, There's moments where she just like wrenches, and if you're in the wrong mood, that complete overwhelming of emotion also has this exaggeration of failed ambition, and so there's such a thin line for her between a successful ambition and a failed ambition, which is also why I think that she's that most diva. Like, like I said, I was talking with Callus earlier. So that's part of that. And then she knew when to play the audience, like that hint in her voice, that Stand By Your Man, where she's just on the edge of crying, where just the whole song collapses and it's like a 2-second moment. Or like when she sings the swingingest swinger you'll ever have. Uh, and has this whole encyclopedia of erotic potential in like 6 words. Or there was another one. Yeah, just her efficiency, her ability to contain so much emotion in so much tiny space. It's just foundationally gorgeous.
Do you have a take on Jessica Chastain's uh, embodiment of Tammy Wynette in the
I
film?
wanted it to be messier. I thought it was a little too contained. I think that one of the things about Wynette continually is you never know which audience she's playing for, even in sort of private moments. And I've always thought that Chastain was a little too contained. Yeah.
And it's a real challenge for the audience who's not as, of course, no pun intended, but kind of pun intended, sorry, well versed, to
Always intend your puns.
Okay, fair. I'm going to take that, Stacy, and I'll take it to heart. To separate her from George Jones, because I don't know if do you know the Mike Judge series, Tales from the Tour Bus?
Yeah.
Okay, which I love, and
Yeah.
I want to just, this audience, do yourself a favor, check them out. Mike Judge, animated Tales from the Tour Bus. And there's, of course, a George Jones one, and Tammy Wynette is in that. And this is not, that's a part of your corrective in this book. It's not about why George and Tammy matter. It's why Tammy matters in her own right.
Yeah.
So I see her sometimes as a woman who survives. She's almost a Gloria Gaynor, I will survive in a way. How do you position her with other women outside of country? If we're mourning the death of Tina Turner.
Yeah, well, and Tina Turner's a really good example. That one of the things that just makes me genuinely angry is how little we talk about abuse. And regardless of how brilliant Wynette is at a bunch of stuff, there's this idea that Jones and Tammy is a great country love story. But that love story also includes Jones probably hitting her, definitively chasing her around her bed with a revolver, most likely sort of vicious, atrocious verbal abuse. And Wynette had all of her husbands did variations of that in some capacity or another. I don't know if Richie hit her, that's an open question. Forced psychiatric treatments, probably some financial malfeasance, definitely physical and psychological abuse, definitely verbal abuse. And we can't sort of continually make people victims, and we can't sort of make binary this a messy life. But one of the things we are, I think, obliged as, if we are sort of have this moral obligation to work through the history of misogyny or the history of gendered violence, that is still foundational to our entertainments or our art. Wynette and Jones, like, that's such a clear example of the work that hasn't been done. But that said, and this is the most difficult part of this whole thing for me, is there are a handful of George Jones and Tammy Wynette songs that are just genius and that have an ardor and a passion and a devotion to each other. And I have not had that in my life. And so it's much easier for me to be in the space where I can sort of, and also weirdly like the funniest and maybe the great, she didn't write a lot of funny songs. Maybe one of the great comic songs in country music history comes from her and George. And so she had this whole miserable space, but she also like sang when all the jazz sad. So I don't know. Jones is messy. But apartment number 9 is sadder than the grand tour.
It is definitely one of those challenges if people just want a neat life or a neat answer or something very tidy. That Tammy Wynette is not their person.
No.
If they want to engage a performer, an artist, a woman, a mother, a survivor of domestic abuse, and take that full on, then a political person, a person who made a lot of choices to endorse things that some would find deeply distressing, then Tammy Wynette is their person if they want that ambivalence.
Well, and if you just want to be sad, like if you just want to soak in your misery, just which we all do.
Is that where is country music now? In that, using that phrase, soak in your misery. Now, I'm not hearing.
Oh, have you heard Kelsey Ballerina's divorce album?
No,
her album this year?
No, please
oh,
tell
okay.
me more.
She had a very messy divorce.
Okay.
A very public and messy divorce. And her divorce album is just lurid and messed up and exhausting and beautiful and like haunting, and I've liked her for a long time, but her like
is that a departure? I mean, it seems to me like
no, it's all there. It's all there.
You think it's we just have to find it in country music? It's still there.
We don't hire enough women. Jada just released something on. She does all this data research on country music, and we don't play enough women in radio. We don't play women back to back. Country radio doesn't play. Country fandom doesn't particularly good job at releasing women's stories. We have Marissa Moss's book, Her Country, talks a lot about this. We were better in the 90s about it, but we're still not good at it. And if we want to have country music be as sophisticated or as difficult, what used to be called adult stories, we have to include the whole range of experiences. But then there's a group of people who I think who aren't on the radio, who won't be on the radio, who are doing songs like that. So I wanted to say Kelsey Ballerina's is on the radio, and it's fantastic, but also Adeem the artist who lives in Nashville. Their last album, Cast Iron Pansexual, and the new one, she's a song on the new one called Books and Records about selling review copies or like selling all the sort of intellectual capital in order to pay rent, which is something that I've done, which I've never seen expressed in a song, which is just beautiful. Or one called Shot to the Heart. I think it's called The Shot to the Heart. I need a fact checker. Like, this is just brilliantly fact checked by a bunch of other people because I have like a gap on this. I'm trying not to be on my phone too, so I would have been on my phone with LK titles, but about deer hunting and using deer hunting as a metaphor for other kinds of loss. And there's Willie Kyle, who wrote a brilliant album last year called Peculiar Missouri. And there's a song there called Tulsa's Last Magician, which has this metaphor about tricks in every sense of the word, tricks and queerness and desire and loss, geography. And then I like Alison Russell stuff, like Joy, whose last name I cannot pronounce, Khan's new album. So it's like, yeah, country's always gonna do country. Like the radio, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. Um, radio will fuck you. Nashville will fuck you. Nashville won't treat you well. Uh, Nashville fuck Tammy. It'll always, like all great capitalist institutions, take more of you than you're able to give. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways of fighting against that.
And that seems to be one of the larger messages of
If-
your book, I think. I think if you're looking at kind of the meta part of it.
Yeah.
What is next for you? What are you working on?
Yeah, I have a tiny little memoir out, something my mother isn't allowed to read. From us, yeah, no, it's not. It's a little difficult, but it's from Coach House in October, which is a Canadian publisher. And then there's a small collection in Bloomsbury called 33 and a Third about individual albums, and I have one about Dolly Parton's White Limousine. That's on the 29th. It'll be 2024.
Oh, you've
Yeah.
been doing.
It's been a good year.
Sounds like you've been doing well. What just as before we go, once you got to the end of this book and you'd gone through all the edits and revisions and you looked at it with some distance, are you at it now from a distance where you can assess how you are a little different maybe in your thinking than you were when you began?
Well, this was really powerful for me in terms of writing, is that, especially like the kidnapping chapter, I thought that I would know what would happen in her life, and I didn't. At the end of it, I like just basic facts. Like, I don't know who kidnapped her.
Right.
And that was a really useful fact. That was a useful moment where I realized that sort of ambivalence or not knowing was as powerful as knowing, and that we need to have more critical work that is just about what we don't know.
Who trained you in your ability to be such an amazing critic or critical?
Oh, there's a
thinker?
cluster of there's this great movement. There's just this little, I don't know, I stumbled onto it and they took me in like a little ragged orphan, and just Dean Hobbs, who wrote Rednecks, Queers and Country Music, who blurbed it, and David Cantwell, whose Heartaches by the Numbers is literally the encyclopedia. It's like with Belfast One wrote that, and then his book on Haggard. Francesca Royster, who wrote Black Country, speaking of Tina, her chapter on Tina Turner in that book is just unbelievable. There's Ann Powers, who's worked for NPR, and her book Good Booty, which takes sex seriously as a critical space, is really important. There's Amanda Martinez, who has a book out, I think next year. I think it's under contract. I think I'm allowed to say that. Who's one of the best scholars on geography and gender on country, which is just her work completely destroys me. There's a guy called Joseph Thompson, who's an academic, who has a book out on war and country next year. Will absolutely change the conversation about what that means, maybe 2 years. Who has the best consideration of class and race that I've encountered. There's a lot of people. I went to a pop conference for like 15 years, and a lot of people came to that. And I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of other people. And then I wanted to talk about, he'll kill me for saying this, but
It's just between us.
I don't think there's anybody on the live stream. There's 4 empty chairs here. So Co Wilson's book on Celine Dion, his 33 and a Third on Celine Dion, which was the only one that was ever expanded into an actual trade paperback as an anniversary of edition. I think we're all working under Carl's tutelage as well. I think that Carl's is the first book, is among the first books at least to consider the implications of taking pop music seriously, and taste seriously, and connecting taste with geography and class. And so Cole's 33 and a third on Celine means it's still the field we're all plowing.
Well, I have to say, for me, Stacy, this has been a masterclass in taking something that I grew up with and really learning how to understand it through the eyes of such a rigorous analyst and skilled critic. I want to thank you so much for being here in Malaprops today and for sharing your work with our audiences. Audience, let me just say again, Stacy's book, Why Tammy Wynette Matters. We have it here in the bookstore. Please check it out and watch this virtual video again on Malaprop's YouTube page, because you're going to want to make yourself your own little bibliography, your own little reading list. Please start with Why Tammy Wynette Matters. It's been a pleasure, Stacy, to speak with you this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, audience.